part of the lease is Section 3, which refers to the condition of the premises. This is actually a huge issue because the first point about it is, how is the landlord going to deliver the space to the tenant? When is the landlord going to deliver the space to the tenant? Who is the tenant? We'll talk more about that in the use section, but it's also important to identify exactly who the tenant is. Not just the name in the initial section, but also what is going to be the corporate name, what's going to be the brand name of the tenant. And so possession has a great deal about zoning and access and when that can be and all of those items. And so possession is basically the have part of it, which is, what do you have? How do you have it? What condition is it in? And so it's important to know that this is a paragraph that landlords like to just gloss over. Landlord attorneys like to just gloss over. But for tenants, it's important to pay attention to this clause because it sets up for a lot which comes later in the lease and controls the lease. And a lot of the lease is really designed to protect the tenant's interest in the building, the landlord's interest, in the building that the landlord owns, and what they're granting under a leasehold agreement, the space, to a tenant. And so that's an important clause. So that's Section 3. Section 4 of most leases, sometimes you see it at the beginning, but mostly it's in Section 4, has to deal with rental, which has to do with what is the tenant paying. Now here, what we're talking about is simply rent, base rent. It's not all the other items that can be also negotiated about, but the rent has to do with how much are you paying, and that could be on an annual basis, on a monthly basis, sometimes even on a weekly basis, depending on the lease. And what's important is to describe in here exactly what's the period over which a lease payment, a rental payment, is being made, and what is that going to be annually, annualized, and what is it going to be monthly. What it doesn't do in most cases, and it's a simple calculation, but it's something that you see in marketing sometimes, but rarely see in leases, which is the per square foot rent annually. Additionally, if the rent increases every year, it's a calculation to determine what are the annual rent increases. Over time, in a normalized, everything else being equal economy, rents bump 3% a year. But there are plenty of leases that bump at 2% a year, some bump at 1.5% a year, some bump at 5%, and some, although this is not as much in favor of late, is the rent increases based on some other factor underlying, such as national interest rates. And then it's a question of which interest rates, and it gets into lots of questions. And this speaks to a fundamental question about leases, which is who relatively has more power, the landlord or the tenant? And I've seen leases where the tenants have had more power and what those kind of leases look like. And I've had plenty where the landlords have had more power. Best of all are leases which are fair. Fair to the landlord, pays the landlord for renting their space to the tenant over the term, and fair to the tenant in that there aren't overly onerous terms that make it more difficult for a tenant to be successful. How much should rent be? Well, that really depends on the business of the tenant, and it gets to another point in lease, which is location, location, location. And I've done retail leases where the tenant has paid a base rent of $250 a foot, and then they pay a percentage of their rent as addition of their sales as additional rent. But I've also done leases that are at over $50 a square foot because of where they're located. For example, how about a retail shop inside the food hall at a university? You have a guaranteed population. They don't spend money, they spend points that their parents have been, or the children have worked for themselves to get points. But it's hugely valuable because of what it's like being at university or at a college or at a big, big, big state school. And it's very different now of what the food options are in college and in university. And yet there's still rent that needs to be paid if it's a third-party vendor, not the college or university, but a third-party company that's taking space. But there are also amenities to the students that go there. It may be coffee, it may be smoothies, it may be protein powder, it may be protein bars, it may be salads. There's all kinds of different options that are available, from the extremely healthy to the extremely unhealthy. And all of those are all there. However, all of that has to come back to rent. What is your base rent? And what are you getting for your base rent? And again, we're only talking about base rent here. And usually what you should find is an alignment between the terms of the rent, which is to say how many years and months is the rent for, and the term of the lease that we talked about initially, which is how long is the term. So if the term's 5 years and the rental only speaks to 1 year, you should see an additional statement as to how the rent increases over time, because there has to be some sort of alignment between those two items. Thank you. There's a lot more to come, and I look forward to sharing that with you. Howard Zupkoff, CapEx Commercial.